My name is Elara Vance. I am 32 years old, and I am a physicist. I never imagined that at my own father's will reading, my older brother, Marcus, would publicly accuse me of being a broke, manipulative gold digger. He stood there, pointing his finger, his face purple with rage, telling a judge that I'd Jupinan, a failed academic, had somehow tricked our dying father into giving me control of his $500 million pharmaceutical empire. His motive was pure greed. As the CEO, he believed he was the sole, rightful heir. But what Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that our father's lawyer was quietly holding a sealed manila envelope. That envelope contained a 15-year-old secret, a legal document that would prove the entire empire Marcus was fighting for was built on my mind, not our father's. The grief of losing my father, Arthur, was a physical weight. It was a cold, heavy stone in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. A constant, dull pressure. He was the only person in the world who truly saw me. Now, I was sitting in a sterile, wood-paneled probate courtroom. The air was thick with tension, a stale mix of old paper, floor wax, and the expensive, acrid cologne radiating from my brother sitting across the aisle. Our father's lawyer, Thomas, had insisted on this formal setting, citing specific instructions in the will. I now understood why. It wasn't for ceremony, it was for containment. My brother, Marcus, was practically vibrating with impatience. He was 5 years older than me, and for our entire lives, he had been the sun our family orbited. I was the cold, distant moon. He wore a $5,000 suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, his face set in a mask of performative grief that didn't quite reach his eyes. His eyes were sharp, assessing, angry. He looked at me with a naked contempt that was so familiar, it was almost comforting. He saw me as I was sure he'd always seen me, a charity case. Our family history was one of sharp, painful contrasts. My mother died when I was 7. Ahaze. Watercolor memory of soft hands, a floral scent, and a quiet, sad violin. Her death left a vacuum that my father, Arthur, a brilliant but struggling chemist, tried to fill with work. He was a genius at formulation, a visionary, but he was a terrible businessman. And our early life was a constant, low-grade thrum of financial anxiety. The lights were always flickering. The phone was occasionally disconnected. I remember the panic in his eyes when the car broke down. Into that anxiety, Marcus fit perfectly. He wasn't a scientist, he was a salesman, even as a teenager. He had a slick, confident charm. He saw our father's genius not as a passion, but as a product. While I was in the garage, building a rudimentary cloud chamber from a fish tank and dry ice, Marcus was in the living room, practicing his pitch on how he would one day fix our father's life. "You're the talent, Dad," he'd say, "but I'm the one who'll make us rich." And our father, desperate for a lifeline, desperate for validation, clung to him. Marcus was the favored one, the business son, the heir apparent from the age of 15. The dynamic was set in stone, and the imbalance was blatant. When Marcus turned 18, he was given a brand new BMW 3 Series. "You have to look the part, son," Dad had said, beaming. "You have to project success." That same year, for my birthday, I was given a used copy of a college physics textbook. The message was clear: Marcus was an investment. I was a hobby. When Marcus graduated from business school, our father, already in debt, co-signed for a sleek downtown apartment so he could entertain clients. When I, 3 years later, graduated high school as valedictorian, my speech was on the sublime beauty of asymptotic freedom in quantum chromodynamics. I looked out from the podium. My father sat in the front row, his expression a perfect, frozen mask of pride and utter, profound confusion. The chair beside him, the one reserved for Marcus, was empty. Marcus had an important client meeting that day. I later learned it was a golf game. The sting of that empty chair, that casual, brutal dismissal, never fully faded. It became a core truth of our family. Marcus builds, Elara plays. But the real secret, the one that defined our entire lives, the one that sat ticking like a bomb in that manila envelope, began when I was 19. I was a sophomore at Caltech on a full scholarship. I was living on instant ramen and the pure, unadulterated high of theoretical physics. I was in my element, surrounded by people who spoke my language. But back home, my father was dying, not physically, but financially. He was stuck. His small, failing lab, Vance Chemical, was about to go under. He had poured every last cent, and then some, into a single revolutionary idea, a new drug delivery formula. He was trying to create a specific type of biodegradable polymer that could encapsulate chemotherapy drugs and target cancer cells directly, leaving healthy cells alone. It was the holy grail, but he couldn't get it to stabilize. The polymer chain kept breaking down too early, dumping the toxic payload harmlessly into the bloodstream. He was out of money, out of time, and out of ideas. I remember the phone call. It was 2 a.m. in Pasadena. I was in the campus library, knee-deep in string theory. His voice on the phone was hollow, a sound I had never heard before. It was the sound of a man who had given up. "It's over, Elara," he'd whispered, his voice cracking. "The bank is calling the loan on Monday. I failed. Marcus is furious. He says I'm a fool, that I should have sold out years ago. What's the problem?" "Dad," I asked, my pen hovering over an equation. The formula, the stabilization, the hydrolysis. He said, his voice thick with shame, "I can't stop it. The ester bonds are too weak. It's impossible. It won't hold. Send me the notes." I said, "Honey, this is high-level polymer chemistry." He argued weakly. It's not your field. It's not theoretical." "Dad," I said, my voice sharp with a focus he didn't understand. "Send them." He sent them, an email with a dozen attachments, a chaotic jumble of formulas, failed test results, and desperate notes. I spent the next 3 days locked in my dorm room. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just had a whiteboard, my notebooks, and a pot of lukewarm coffee. His notes were brilliant but chaotic. He was attacking the problem like a chemist. How do I make the bonds stronger? But he wasn't just a chemist. He was my father. I knew how his mind worked. He always missed the simple, elegant solution because he was looking for the complex, brute force one. He was trying to stop the hydrolysis. I looked at it differently. I am a physicist. I think in terms of systems, forces, and triggers. Why stop a force? Why not use it? The eureka moment wasn't a flash of light. It was a slow, creeping dawn of realization. He was building a wall. He needed a door. What if the polymer wasn't supposed to be a shield? What if it was a fuse? I looked at the bonds. He was right. They were weak, but they were predictably weak. I ran the numbers. They would break down at a specific heature, acidic pH, the exact pH of a cancerous tumor's microenvironment. He was trying to build a perfect cage. I realized he needed a smart one, a cage that would stay locked in the neutral pH of the bloodstream, but would automatically unlock and release its payload when it encountered the acidic signature of cancer. My hand was shaking. I grabbed my notebook, the one with the worn, blue Caltech cover. I didn't just write an idea. I wrote the entire thing. The mathematics of the bond decay, the specific catalytic enzyme that would trigger the cascade, the precise, crystalline lattice structure that would hold the payload until it hit the target. I wrote for 6 straight hours. My arm ached. When I was done, I looked at it. I knew, the most important work I would ever do. I signed the bottom of the last page. Elara Vance, 3:17 a.m. I took a photo of every single page with my phone and emailed them to him. Then I called. He picked up on the first ring. "Dad," I said, my voice hoarse. "Go to your email. You're not trying to stop the hydrolysis. You're trying to time it. You need to use the cancer's own acidic environment as the trigger." There was a long silence on the line, just his breathing. Then, a sound I will never, ever forget, a choked, broken, overwhelmed sob. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Elara. Oh my God. It's beautiful. You did it. You saved me. I love you." "Dad," I said, tears streaming down my own face. "I love you, too," he whispered back. "My brilliant girl." A week later, his new lawyer called me. We had a long, formal conversation. I signed a document, a deed of gift, and a non-disclosure agreement. I, Elara Vance, being of sound mind, did hereby gift the intellectual property for this formula to my father, Arthur Vance, for the sum of $1, for his use in perpetuity. It was my gift to him. I didn't want money. I didn't want fame. I wanted him to be okay. I wanted to go back to my equations. He filed the patent. Vance Therapeutics was born. The formula, which the press dubbed the Vance Formula, worked. It was a miracle drug. It saved lives. And it made our family fantastically, unbelievably wealthy. Marcus, with a miracle product to sell, was a shark in water. He took that single patent and built a $500 million empire. He became the CEO. He believed, he truly believed, that our father was the sole genius who had created it. And I let him. I finished my PhD. I took a low-paying research fellowship. I lived in a small, rented apartment, drove a 10-year-old car, and dedicated my life to pure, theoretical science. I was happy. To Marcus, my quiet, modest life was the ultimate proof of my failure. He couldn't comprehend a world where success wasn't measured in sports cars and stock options. He saw my life as a deep, personal embarrassment. And now, sitting in this cold courtroom, he looked at me with a hatred so pure, it was almost impressive. He saw a beggar, a failure, a gutter trash worm, his words at the funeral trying to steal what wasn't hers. He had no idea. He was a king sitting on a throne, screaming at the architect who had built the castle. The escalation began, as it so often does. Not with a bang, but with a phone call. I was a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton, working on a simulation of dark matter halos. When the call came, it wasn't Marcus. It was our family doctor, Elara. "Doctor," Singh said, his voice gentle but firm, "it's your father. He's had a mild heart attack. He's stable. But it's the underlying condition. His blood work. It's not good. The consensus is he has about 6 months. I think you should come home." I dropped everything. I didn't take a leave. I quit. My supervising professor was horrified. "Elara, you're on the brink of a major paper." "It's my father," I said, already packing my small, one-bedroom apartment. There was no decision to be made. Marcus, of course, was too busy to handle it. "This is a critical quarter, Elara," he'd said over the phone, his voice tight with annoyance, as if my father's illness was a personal inconvenience. "I can't just drop everything. The company needs me. It's good you're, free. You can handle the house." I moved back into my childhood bedroom. It was a time capsule of my teenage self-physics posters, shelves of worn-out sci-fi novels, a faint smell of dust and old paper. The contrast was stark. Down the hall was the sprawling master suite Marcus had built for himself during a renovation, which he now used as a home office. On the rare occasions he wasn't at the actual office, He was barely there. Always in important meetings. Always closing a deal. He treated my presence as that of a high-end, live-in nurse. But those 6 months, they were the most important of my life. The awkwardness between my father and me, the lifetime of misunderstood priorities. It all just dissolved. The pretense was gone. He was no longer Arthur Vance, the founder, and I was no longer Elara, the hobbyist. We were just a father and a daughter, with a clock. At first, he was weak. I'd read to him, not fiction, but my old physics textbooks. I'd sit by his bed, my voice quiet, and explain the Lagrangian. I'd talk about my dark matter research, and for the first time, he listened. One afternoon, his eyes were clear. He looked at me. I really looked at me, and his eyes filled with tears. I never understood. He whispered, his hand, thin and papery, finding mine. It's okay. Dad. No, he said, his voice gaining a small spark of his old strength. It's not. I spent your whole life looking for a mirror. And Marcus. He was a perfect mirror. He wanted what I thought I wanted. Money. Success. A name. But you. He squeezed my hand. I was looking at a mirror. Elara. When I should have been looking at the sun. You were building universes in your head. And I was just proud I could pay the bills. I am so sorry. We didn't just talk about science. We talked about that night. The night I sent him the formula. I never told you. He said, his voice low. Marcus was here that night. When I got your email, he had been screaming at me for hours, calling me a failure. A pathetic old man. He said I had ruined his future. He closed his eyes. The memory painful. And then, your email came. I opened it. I read your equations. And I started to cry. Marcus thought I had finally broken. He sneered at me. He said, "What? Is little Elara sending you her homework? What did you do?" Dad, I looked at him, and I said, "She just saved us. She just saved everything." He didn't believe me. He refused to. When the money started pouring in, he convinced himself. He built a story in his head where he was the one who had managed the breakthrough. That your doodling was just a lucky guess. He needs to believe that Elara, he needs to be the hero of the story. Marcus, in his rare visits, saw this new bond, and he was furious. He didn't see a daughter connecting with her dying father. He saw a gold digger manipulating a sick, old man. The closer I got to Dad, the more hostile Marcus became. Don't tire him out with your fantasy physics. Elara. He'd snap, walking in and throwing his briefcase onto a chair. He needs to rest for his real work. I have financials for him to sign. Marcus, my father said, his voice weak but firm. Leave us. Your sister she is explaining the universe to me. It's more important. The look of pure, venomous hatred Marcus shot me in that moment was terrifying. He saw his inheritance, his entire identity, being threatened. He saw a last-minute, desperate play for the money. The funeral was a disgusting spectacle. It was huge, hundreds of people, a testament not to my father, the man, but to Vance Therapeutics, the empire. Marcus was in his element. The grieving son, the strong heir, accepting condolences. His eulogy was a masterpiece of self-aggrandizement. He spoke for 20 minutes about his sacrifice, his late nights, his building this company hand in hand with his father. My father was the dreamer, Marcus said, his voice thick with fake emotion. But I was the builder. I took his dream, and I made it a reality. A $500 million reality. He glanced at me, sitting in the front row, his eyes cold. And I'm so glad that in his final months, he had company. That my sister, Elara, the academic, was able to return home at the end. It was a subtle, brilliant, public dig. He had defined me the absent, unemployed daughter who showed up when the work was done. At the reception, held at his massive, stérile mansion. It got worse. This was the setup for his public reversal. I was standing alone, holding a glass of club soda I didn't want, when Dr. Chen, our head of R&D, and one of my father's oldest friends, approached me. "Elara," he said, his eyes kind. "Your father. He was so proud of you. He always said you were the real genius in the family. He told me, Marcus builds the walls, but Elara, she drew the blueprints for the whole city." I felt a warmth spread through my chest. He said that, before I could process it, Marcus was there. He slung his arm around Dr. Chen's shoulder, a predator's smile on his face. "Dr. Chen, so glad you could make it. Talking to my sister." "I see." He looked at me, his smile not touching his eyes. "Elara, oh. Don't let her fool you. She's the PhD. Brilliant. Of course. But, well, you know, still trying to find a real job." He lowered his voice, but it was a stage whisper, loud enough for me and everyone in our small circle to hear. "It's a shame. Really. All that brains. And not a penny to her name. It's sad. Dad always felt sorry for her. That's why I've been sending her money for years." I froze. He was lying. He had never sent me a dime. I felt the blood drain from my face. The humiliation was a physical, burning heat. He was painting me as a charity case, a pathetic, broke failure that he had to support. And in that moment, I understood his entire strategy. He didn't just think I was poor. He needed me to be poor. He needed to prove to the world that my path, the path of science, of academics, was a failure. And his path, the path of money, was the only one that mattered. I knew, with cold certainty, that he wasn't just guessing. He's a businessman. He would have done his due diligence on what he saw as a threat. He would have hired a private investigator. I knew what that PI would have found. My small, rented apartment, my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the outstanding balance on my graduate student loans. To Marcus, this was his evidence. This was his smoking gun. He thought this report proved I was a desperate gold digger. He couldn't see that this was his trap. He was so blinded by my price tag that he had never, ever bothered to ask about my value. The night before the will reading, my phone rang. It was Thomas, my father's lawyer. His voice was low, cautious, and kind. "Elara," he said, "I'm calling as a courtesy. As you know, we're meeting in Judge Harris's chambers tomorrow. Your father." He was very specific about that. "I know. Thomas." He paused. "Elara. He made some significant changes. In the last few months, I stayed silent. I want you to be prepared tomorrow." He continued. "Marcus. He is not going to react well." Did he tell you why he was making the changes?" I asked. My voice quiet. There was a long pause on the line. I heard him rustle some papers. "He did," Thomas said, his voice softening. "He told me he was setting the ledger straight. He said he was paying a debt that was long overdue. He said, 'The world thinks I'm a genius, Thomas, but the real genius is my daughter, and I'm going to make sure, at least on paper, that the world finally knows it.'" He cleared his throat. "Marcus is coming in tomorrow expecting a coronation. Be ready. Elara." I hung up the phone. I wasn't scared. I wasn't excited. I felt a cold, clear, and profoundly sad certainty. I knew what was in the will, and I knew, with absolute dread, what was in that sealed manila envelope Thomas was holding. My father's last act wasn't just a gift. It was a confession, and it was a weapon. The coronation was about to become an execution. We were led into a small, private probate courtroom. Not the grand, public ones. It felt less like a court of law and more like a pre-war tribunal. The room was paneled in dark, imposing mahogany that seemed to absorb all the light and sound. A single state flag stood in the corner, its gold fringe gathering dust. At the front, on a raised dais, sat Judge Eleanor Harris. She was an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her silver hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful, and she looked at all of us over her reading glasses with an expression of profound impatience. This was a woman who did not suffer fools, and I felt a sudden, cold certainty that my brother was about to give her the worst afternoon of her career. Thomas, our father's lawyer, sat at a small table to the side. He looked tired. He was a kind, older man, a friend of my father's for 30 years, and I knew this was as hard for him as it was for me. In front of him was a stack of documents, and on top of that stack, sitting innocuously, was a single levery, sealed, and slightly yellowed manila envelope. My stomach tightened the moment I saw it. That was it. That was the bomb. Marcus Strodena minutelate. A deliberate power move. He walked like he owned the building. His personal lawyer, a younger, shark-faced man, trailed behind him like a pilot fish. Marcus gave me a dismissive, pitying smirk as he passed. A look that said, "Why are you even here?" This is a formality. He didn't just sit. He took his seat directly opposite Thomas, sprawling slightly, projecting an air of total, unbothered ownership. He was vibrating with a smug, self-satisfied energy. This was his day. This was the coronation. "We are here," Judge Harris began, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the heavy silence, for the reading of the last will and testament of Arthur Vance. She nodded at Thomas. The decedent, Mr. Vance, was specific in his request for this formal, judicial oversight. Her eyes flickered with a brief spark of curiosity. "I'll confess, this is a highly unusual setup for a will reading. He must have anticipated conflict." "He did, Your Honor," Thomas said quietly. He stood, his hands fumbling slightly with the top document. Marcus leaned forward, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the polished table. He was ready. He was practically salivating. "Thank you, Your Honor," Thomas said. He picked up the main document. "This is the final, legally executed will of Arthur Vance, signed 3 months prior to his passing, at which time he was fully of sound mind and body. All previous wills are hereby revoked." Marcus's drumming stopped. He steepled his fingers, a poor imitation of our father's thoughtful pose. "First, Thomas Reed. To my long-time employees, various personnel bequests." He read through a small list of names our father's longtime assistant. His first lab technician, small stock options, cash gifts, kindgestuures. Then he paused. He took a slow sip of water from a small plastic cup. The room was suffocatingly quiet. I could hear the faint whir of the air conditioning. "Second, to my son, Marcus Vance." I watched Marcus. He sat up straighter, his chest puffed out, just slightly. His smug smile widened. This was it. "I leave 49% of the controlling shares in Vance Therapeutics." The silence that followed was not quiet. It was a vacuum. I didn't breathe. I watched my brother. The smug expression didn't just falter. It froze. His smile cracked. It was a horrifying, fascinating thing to watch. He looked confused, as if he'd misheard the words. His head tilted. "What?" he whispered, too low for the judge to hear. His eyes darted to his lawyer, who looked just as baffled. I saw it. The first crack in the facade. He didn't understand. Thomas, his face impassive, continued as if he hadn't heard the small, strangled sound. "Furthermore, I leave the position of Chief Executive Officer, which he currently holds, to my son, Marcus, with the stipulation that his salary and all compensation be set not by himself, but by a formal vote of the board of directors. The color was starting to drain from Marcus's face. He was CEO, but he'd just lost his power. He was an employee. 49%. It was a functional, public demotion. He had been sidelined, but if he only had 49, who had? His head swiveled toward me, his eyes, now wide with a dawning, frantic panic, locking onto mine. No, it couldn't be. And third, Thomas continued, his voice steady, projecting clearly into the small room, to my daughter, Elara Vance. Marcus made a small gasping sound. I leave 51% of the controlling shares in Vance Therapeutics. What? It wasn't a word. It was a roar. Marcus shot to his feet, his heavy oak chair scraping violently, screeching against the wood floor as it was thrown backward. What did he say, Mr. Vance? Sit down, Judge Harris snapped, her hand instinctively reaching for her gavel. No, this is ridiculous. This is insane. This is a joke. Marcus was trembling, his face turning from pale to a deep, blotchy red. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger at me. This is her. She did this. She manipulated him. That is a serious accusation. Mr. Vance, the judge said, her voice dangerously calm, her eyes narrowing. It's the truth, Marcus yelled. He was unhinged. All the slick, corporate charm gone, revealing the spoiled, furious child underneath. My father was sick, he was weak, he wasn't in his right mind, and she swooped in. For 6 months. Whispering in his ear, he turned to the judge. His voice now, a desperate, pleading performance. Your Honor, you have to see what this is. This is a classic case of elder abuse, of undue influence. She's a con artist. He then did exactly what I knew he would. He had been waiting for this moment. He thought this was his true payoff. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, snapped it open, and pulled out a thick, professionally bound report. I have proof, he shouted, throwing the report onto the table in front of the judge. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. I didn't want to do this. I wanted to protect my father's dignity, but she forced my hand. She forced me to show the world what she really is. Thomas just watched, his face a mask of sad resignation. This was all part of the script. My father's script. Judge Harris looked at the report. It had a cheap, glossy cover confidential investigation Elara Vance. And what, exactly, is this? Mr. Vance, the judge asked, her voice laced with ice. That, Marcus said, his voice dripping with triumphant venom, is a full financial investigation I had conducted on my sister. I had her followed. Your Honor, I had her finances pulled. Read it. Just read it. You'll see. He was pacing now. A predator who had finally cornered his prey. She's a failure. She's a 32-year-old physicist who lives in a one-bedroom rented apartment in a bad neighborhood. She drives a 10-year-old car with a dent in the fender. She has Newtman 10-year-old car with a dent in the fender. As of last month, over $60,000 in student loan debt. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. This is not a successful woman. This is a gold digger. This is a broke, desperate academic who saw my father was sick. I saw her chance, and preyed on a weak, dying old man. She poisoned him against me. The son who built this company with him. The son who made him rich. He was sweating, but he was high on his own rage. He then made his final, fatal error. He jabbed his finger at me again, his whole body shaking. She doesn't deserve this, he roared. She knows nothing about this company. She knows nothing about the technology that makes it run. She couldn't tell you the first thing about the Vance Formula. She's a parasite, and I demand this will be thrown out. He said it. He finally said it. The trap was set. The trap was sprung. The room was dead silent again. The accusations, so vile, so specific, and so public, hung in the air. Judge Harris looked at me. Her expression was unreadable. Ms. Vance, do you have a response to these? Very serious allegations. I took a slow, deep breath. The anger was there, but it was cold. It was the drama engine of my mind taking over. I felt strangely, completely calm. Your Honor, I said, my voice quiet but not shaking. Everything my brother has said about my apartment, my car, and my student loan debt is true. Marcus let out a short, sharp, "Ha, a victory." His lawyer smirked. He thought I had just confessed. But his conclusion, I continued, is false. I did not manipulate my father. She's lying, Marcus shouted. That's enough. Mr. Vance, the judge snapped. At that moment, Thomas, the lawyer, stood up. This was the moment of total isolation. Marcus looked at him, expecting, for some insane reason, that Thomas would back him up. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice heavy with significance. Mr. Vance, Arthur. He anticipated this. He anticipated this exact accusation. Marcus's face fell. Thomas, what are you doing? You're my lawyer. 2. No. Marcus, Thomas said, looking at him with profound sadness. I was your father's lawyer, and my loyalty is to my client. And my client, Mr. Arthur Vance, entrusted me with this. He reached down and picked up the yellowed, sealed manila envelope. He entrusted me with this envelope 6 weeks before his death, Thomas said, holding it up for the court to see. The instructions were very specific, and they are notarized. I was to keep this envelope sealed and in my office safe. I was only to present it to this court in the event that 1. His will was read, and 2. His son, Marcus Vance, formally contested the distribution of shares. Thomas placed the envelope gently on the judge's dais. Marcus has just done so. My obligations to my client are now fulfilled. The blood drained from Marcus's face. He was staring at the envelope as if it were a snake. What? What is that? What did you do? What trick is this? I did what my client asked. Marcus, Thomas said, and sat down. Judge Harris picked up the envelope. She examined the heavy wax seal. This is highly unusual, she murmured. She took a letter opener from her desk. With a single, sharp movement, she slit the envelope open. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I could hear Marcus's short, panicked breaths. She pulled out 2 documents. One was a single, folded legal document. The other was my notebook. My old, blue, Caltech-issued notebook from 15 years ago. My heart stopped. I recognized my own handwriting on the cover. The judge put on her reading glasses. She read the legal document first. I watched her face. It was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. Her expression, at first professionally curious, flickered. Her eyes widened slightly. She looked down at the document again, reading a line a second time, as if she couldn't believe it. Then her gaze lifted, and she looked at me, not with pity, not with contempt, with awe, a look I had never seen from anyone but my father. She then unfolded the notebook, her eyes scanning my old, frantic equations. Her jaw went slack. Finally, she looked back at Marcus, and her expression, the look of awe, hardened into something I had never seen before. It was a cold, sharp, and sudden anger. She put the papers down. She took off her glasses. She looked at the bailiff at the back of the room. Officers, she said, her voice a steel blade. Seal this courtroom immediately. No one leaves this room. The bailiff, a large man who looked bored 5 minutes ago, now looked alert. He walked to the heavy oak doors and slid the thick bolt across. The sound was a definitive artid, terrifying thud. The room was sealed. Marcus, for the first time in his life, looked small. The blood had drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, pale white. He was staring at the old, blue Caltech notebook on the judge's desk, as if it were a bomb. What is that? He stammered. His voice no longer a roar, but a reedy, thin whisper. Thomas, what did you do? I did what your father instructed. Marcus, Thomas said, his voice heavy with sadness. Judge Harris put her glasses back on. She looked at Marcus with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice a steel blade. In my 20 years on this bench, I have seen a lot of family greed. I have seen sons and daughters fight over heirlooms. I have seen baseless accusations, but I have never seen anything as profoundly, disgustingly ignorant as this. She held up the single legal document. This, she said, is a legally notarized deed of gift and intellectual property transfer. It is dated 15 years ago. From Elara Vance to her father, Arthur Vance. She began to read. I, Elara Vance, being of sound mind, do hereby gift the full and complete intellectual property rights for the chemical formula, patent pending, known as the Vance Formula, to my father, Arthur Vance, for the sum of $1, to be used in perpetuity by the company Vance Chemical, in recognition of his lifetime of work and in gratitude for his love and support. She put the paper down. Then, she picked up my old notebook. And this, she said, her voice shaking slightly with what I recognized as suppressed rage, is the original, handwritten, dated, and signed formula itself. This is the source code of your entire $500 million company. She looked at Marcus, her eyes like ice. The parasite, you accused of knowing nothing about your company, is, in fact, the person who invented it. Marcus just deflated. The rage, the arrogance, the righteous fury, it all evaporated, leaving a hollow, slack-jawed shell. He sank. Not just sat, but sank into his chair. What? He whispered. No. Dad invented that, he told me. He always said. He worked for years. It seems your father told you a story you were comfortable with. The judge snapped. A story that fed your arrogance. But the facts, the law, are clear. She leaned forward, her voice dropping, but carrying more menace than his roar ever had. The technology you claimed she knew nothing about was, in fact, her invention. The failure you mocked for being in debt was the very person who created your wealth. The money you claimed she was stealing was, in fact, hers to begin with. Your father's will was not an act of manipulation. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice quiet but devastating. It was an act of restitution. He was, finally, paying her back. He didn't just give her 51% of the company. He returned 1% of her own work to her. He was, as Thomas said, setting the ledger straight. Poetic justice was not a concept I had ever truly understood until that moment. Marcus had built his entire identity, his entire sense of self-worth, on the belief that he was the builder and I was the drain. And in one 5-minute span, he had been forced to learn that he was just a tenant, living in a house that I had designed. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a new, terrifying, hollow respect. You, he whispered. You wrote it in college. I just nodded. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I just felt profoundly, deeply sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that my father had to use a courtroom from beyond the grave to tell the truth. Mr. Vance, the judge said, her voice pulling him from his stupor. Given this evidence, do you wish to maintain your contest of this will? Based on the allegation that your sister is a gold digger with no knowledge of the company Marcus's lawyer, who looked like he wanted to crawl under the table, frantically whispered in his ear. Marcus just shook his head. Unable to speak, he slumped forward, his face in his hands. "No, Your Honor," he whispered, his voice muffled. I dropped the contest. I thought not." Judge Harris said. "The will is validated. This proceeding is over. Officers, you may unseal the doors." Thomas and I walked out of the courtroom. Marcus was left sitting there, his lawyer trying to talk to him, but he just stared at the table. He was a king without a kingdom, a CEO who had just discovered he was only a manager. The final inversion was complete. I was now the majority shareholder of Vance Therapeutics. I was the chief innovation officer. I was, in effect, his boss. The next day, I walked into the R&D headquarters of the company, a place I had never been invited. I walked past the gleaming, million-dollar labs that my equations had paid for, the scientists, many of whom were my age, looked up as I passed. They knew. The story had torn through the company like wildfire. Dr. Chen, the man Marcus had insulted at the funeral, was the first to greet me. He wasn't just the head of R&D. I now understood he was the only one, besides Thomas, that my father had trusted with the full story. He came to me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Dr. Vance," he said, shaking my hand. "Welcome. It's about time." He walked me to the back of the facility, to a small, quiet office. "Your father. He left this for you. He never let anyone use it." He opened the door. It was a perfect replica of my old dorm room, a whiteboard covered in equations, my old textbooks on a shelf, and in the center, my original, blue Caltech notebook, which the judge had returned to me. He said, "Dr. Chen's voice was thick with emotion, that the real company wasn't in the executive wing. It was in here. He said we were just waiting for you to come home and take over." I spent the next 6 months not in the CEO's chair, but in the lab. I established a new pure research foundation, pouring tens of millions of dollars into the kind of theoretical science that doesn't have an immediate profit margin. I was thriving. And Marcus was regressing. He was trapped. This was the true genius of my father's plan. He didn't fire him. He didn't disinherit him. He caged him. Marcus was still the CEO. He still had his 49%. He was still fantastically wealthy on paper. But he had zero power. He had to report to me. He had to come to board meetings where I held the deciding 51% vote. He had to sit there, his jaw clenched, as I, the failed academic, vetoed his proposals for aggressive marketing and instead approved funding for a new particle accelerator. His poetic justice was that he was forced, every single day, to come to work and witness the genius of the sister he had dismissed as a failure. He was rich, but he was irrelevant. He was a king in name only, a prisoner in the very castle he thought he had built. He was forced to live with the consequences of his arrogance. And to me, that was a fate far more satisfying than poverty. I went to my father's grave a week after the reading. I brought my old, blue notebook with me. "You did it. Dad," I whispered, sitting on the grass. "You set the ledger straight." I ran my hand over the worn cover. I think I understand now. You didn't just do this to pay me back. You did this because you knew. You knew I would never fight for myself. I would have stayed in my lab. I would have let him have it all. Just for peace. He knew Marcus. He knew his son's greed would be his downfall. He knew Marcus would contest the will. He knew Marcus would bring his proof. He had, in his final, brilliant act, used his son's own arrogance as a weapon against him. He gave me 2 gifts. First, the gift of his company. But second, the gift of this fight. He knew I would have to see the evidence of my own worth. He forced me to stop hiding in the shadows of academia and claim my own power. He forced me to stop being the architect, and finally, publicly, become the queen. The world, my brother's world, measures value in dollars, in cars, in titles. But real value is in an idea, an equation on a piece of paper, a formula that saves a life. Marcus saw the price tag. My father, in the end, finally saw the worth. My brother spent his whole life looking at my bank account, and he thought it defined me. He never thought to look at my bookshelf. Have you ever been judged by the wrong metrics? Have you ever had someone dismiss your passion, only to find out it was the most valuable thing you had? Share your story in the comments below, and if this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the power.